The Pacific skies had grown eerily quiet by late 1943. What once roared with dogfights and bombing raids was now littered with wrecks, the skeletal remains of Japan's once mighty air fleet. But one discovery would leave American pilots stunned. On a captured Japanese airstrip, U.S. forces came across something they never expected: a perfectly intact Mitsubishi G4M bomber, abandoned but undamaged. Its emerald-green fuselage shimmered under the tropical sun, and the large red Hinamaru circles on its wings still glared defiantly. Engineers and pilots surrounded it, curious and cautious, unsure of what secrets this mysterious bomber might reveal. When they pried open its panels, they froze. There it was, a gaping fuel tank, massive and fully exposed, sitting unarmored inside the wing. No self-sealing lining, no protection whatsoever. To the Americans, it was unthinkable. This wasn't a small design flaw, it was a death sentence. And yet Japan had sent thousands of its finest airmen into battle aboard this machine. That day, American engineers didn't just capture a bomber. They uncovered the philosophy of a nation at war, one that valued reach and speed over safety. Honor over survival. This is the story of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, the beautiful yet doomed bomber that defined Japan's air strategy and revealed the fatal weakness at the heart of its military power. It all began in 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy envisioned an aircraft unlike anything the world had seen before. A bomber that could fly thousands of kilometers across the Pacific, strike its target, and return home without needing refueling or escort fighters. Japan's empire was vast and stretched across island chains, where airfields were few and far apart. For their plans of expansion to succeed, they needed a weapon that could reach distant shores, fast, light, and deadly. And so the call went out to Mitsubishi. Inside Mitsubishi's design halls in Nagoya, a small team of engineers gathered around blueprints and empty coffee cups, tasked with an impossible challenge. Their mission: to create a bomber with extreme range, one that could outfly any enemy pursuit. But the Navy's demands were ruthless. The aircraft had to carry a ton of bombs, fly farther than any Western model, and still remain agile enough to evade interception. It was a balancing act that defied the physics of war. The lead engineer, Kiro Honjo, understood that to achieve range and speed, weight had to be stripped away. Every kilogram mattered. Armor plating? Too heavy. Bulletproof glass? Unnecessary. Self-sealing fuel tanks? They added precious weight, slowing the aircraft down and reducing its range. And so one by one, the safety features that Western designers saw as essential were erased. The Japanese Navy accepted this sacrifice, believing that the aircraft's unmatched speed and range would protect it from harm. Speed is armor, they insisted. Months passed as engineers built and rebuilt prototypes. Aluminum sheets were molded into sleek, curving forms. The result was breathtaking: an elegant cigar-shaped fuselage with long, slender wings that seemed to stretch endlessly, giving it an otherworldly grace. When it finally took to the skies for its first test flight in 1939, observers watched in awe as the machine soared above the airfield, silent and swift. The test pilot reported, "It flies like an arrow." The aircraft was given its official name, the Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 attack bomber, but among Japanese pilots, it soon earned the affectionate nickname Hamaki, meaning flying cigar. When the G4M entered service in 1941, Japan had found its perfect weapon. It could cover nearly 3,000 kilometers without stopping, giving it the ability to reach far beyond the Pacific horizon. The bomber could take off from bases in Formosa and strike the Philippines, then continue on to return without refueling. No other nation had such a weapon in its arsenal. Its twin Nakajima engines purred with power, and its streamlined body cut through the air like a knife. The Imperial Japanese Navy celebrated it as a triumph of engineering and vision, and indeed its debut was spectacular. In December 1941, only days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, G4M bombers took part in one of the most stunning victories of the war. British naval forces, including the mighty battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were caught in open water off the coast of Malaya. Without fighter cover, the ships became easy targets. The G4M swept in from above, flying in tight formations, releasing torpedoes with clinical precision. Within minutes, both British vessels were sinking beneath the waves. It was the first time in history that battleships had been sunk solely by aircraft while at sea, and it sent shockwaves through the Allied command. The world now understood the reach and lethality of Japan's new air arm, but even in that moment of triumph, a quiet truth began to reveal itself. The very thing that made the G4M powerful, its lightweight design, also made it vulnerable. The bomber's fuel tanks were enormous, filling much of its wings and fuselage. They were unprotected, made of thin aluminum without any self-sealing capability. A single bullet could pierce the tank and ignite it instantly. Pilots began to notice that when their comrades went down, the aircraft didn't just crash, it exploded in mid-air, consumed in a ball of fire so bright that it could be seen miles away. Still, the Japanese High Command refused to alter the design. Every kilogram of protection meant a shorter range, and range was everything. The Empire's reach depended on it. So the Betty, as the Allies later called it, continued to fly, graceful, swift, and dangerously fragile. The men who flew it began to understand its dual nature. They admired its beauty, its ease of handling, its remarkable endurance. But deep down they also feared it. "It's a fine aircraft," one pilot said with a grim smile, "as long as you don't get shot at." And in the Pacific, avoiding bullets was becoming harder with each passing month. The birth of the Betty marked a turning point in aerial warfare, a triumph of ambition over caution, innovation over survivability. It was an aircraft born from brilliance and belief, but destined to face the cruel realities of modern combat. It would soar higher, fly farther, and strike deeper than any bomber before it. But for the crews inside, every mission would be a gamble against fire. By mid-1942, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty had become a common and fearsome sight across the Pacific. Its long, sleek wings and deep engine roar were the harbinger of Japanese air power, sweeping over islands and fleets with unnerving precision. From Rabaul to the Solomon Islands, Allied troops learned to dread that distinct hum above the clouds, a sign that somewhere out there bombs were already falling. But beneath the success stories and newspaper headlines, cracks in the legend were beginning to show. And for the men who flew the Betty, those cracks could mean the difference between life and death. The design that had once been Japan's greatest strength was turning into its greatest weakness. The same light frame that allowed the G4M to cross immense distances now offered almost no protection in battle. American fighters, faster, tougher, and equipped with heavy .50 caliber machine guns, were entering the war in large numbers. When they met the Betty, the results were devastating. A few bursts into the wings or fuselage could ignite the bomber's vast fuel tanks, turning it into a flaming comet that plunged into the sea. The pilots knew this too well. Veteran crews quickly developed a morbid saying, "One hit, one torch." Yet even with this grim reputation, the Betty continued to serve as the workhorse of Japan's aerial campaign. There were simply no replacements that could match its range. Every mission order came with an unspoken understanding. They would take off knowing that coming back was never guaranteed. In early 1943, during the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal, American pilots of the Cactus Air Force began encountering the Betty more frequently. These engagements were fast, furious, and fatal. The Betty bombers, often flying without escort fighters, made easy targets for the nimble F-4F Wildcats and P-38 Lightnings that patrolled the skies. Many Japanese crews barely had time to react before tracer fire ripped through their engines and fuel tanks, engulfing the aircraft in fire. Allied pilots started referring to them as flying Zippos, a cruel nod to their tendency to explode like lighters when hit. But despite the odds, there were men who managed to make the impossible happen. Among them was Lieutenant Osamu Kusano, a 25-year-old pilot, known for his calmness under pressure. On one fateful mission, Kusano's squadron was sent to attack a U.S. supply convoy off the coast of New Georgia. The weather was rough, with thick clouds masking visibility, but they pushed forward. As they descended through the mist, Kusano's formation was ambushed by American P-38s waiting above the cloud layer. Within seconds, chaos erupted. One Betty after another was shredded by machine gun fire, bursting into flames and spiraling toward the sea. Kusano's own aircraft was hit. Tracer rounds pierced the wing, fuel spraying into the air like a mist. He could smell the fumes inside the cockpit, thick and suffocating. His gunners screamed that the right tank was leaking. Kusano knew what that meant. One spark and they were gone. But the young pilot refused to give in. With engines roaring and smoke trailing behind, he pushed his bomber lower, skimming the surface of the ocean to evade the pursuing fighters. The P-38s made repeated dives, firing bursts that tore chunks from his tail, but somehow the Betty held together. At one point, Kusano even dipped his plane so low that seawater splashed over the fuselage, extinguishing the leaking fuel before it could ignite. When he finally reached the safety of cloud cover, the surviving crew could hardly believe they were still alive. Stories like Kusano's became the stuff of legend among Japanese squadrons. His damaged Betty, riddled with bullet holes and leaking fuel, managed to limp back to base, a rare miracle in an age when most never returned. When his superiors asked how he'd survived, Kusano gave a faint smile and said, "The ocean saved us, but luck was not a strategy, and the Japanese command knew it." Engineers were ordered to reinforce the G4M's design, but the war's pace made it nearly impossible. Adding armor or protective tanks would reduce its range, crippling Japan's ability to strike faraway targets, so the pilots continued flying the same fragile machines, caught in a cruel trade-off between mobility and mortality. In the skies over the Pacific, the Betty's weaknesses were becoming an open secret. American pilots learned to exploit them mercilessly, aiming for the wings where the massive fuel tanks were stored. Each hit was spectacular, a mid-air explosion that left nothing but fragments raining into the waves. And yet, even as losses mounted, the Betty remained Japan's most used bomber. Its reach was unmatched, its silhouette unmistakable, and its crews, knowing full well what awaited them, continued to climb into those thin metal coffins day after day. By 1943, the legend of the Betty had changed. No longer seen as a symbol of invincible reach, it had become a symbol of tragic bravery, of men flying into battle in machines that demanded everything from them and gave them nothing in return. When the first captured Mitsubishi G4M bomber was finally recovered, nearly intact, it was treated like a gift from the heavens by U.S. intelligence. The aircraft had crash-landed on a small atoll after sustaining light damage during an engagement with P-38s. Its crew had been killed or captured, but the airframe itself remained largely intact. A rare opportunity for Allied engineers to examine the Japanese Navy's prized long-range bomber up close. For months, the Allies had speculated about what made this plane capable of reaching such extraordinary distances and carrying such heavy payloads. Now, for the first time, they would see the truth for themselves. When the damaged Betty was ferried to a makeshift airstrip for inspection, American mechanics and intelligence officers gathered around like archaeologists uncovering an ancient relic. The first thing they noticed was its sheer size. Its fuselage was sleek and elongated, its wings wide and elegant, almost fragile-looking compared to the rugged American bombers they were used to. But as they moved closer, their fascination turned to disbelief. Where they expected to see armor plating around the cockpit and fuel tanks, there was almost nothing. The metal skin was thin, startlingly thin, and there was no self-sealing system in the fuel tanks. It was as if the designers had ignored every lesson about survivability. One engineer ran his hand across the fuselage and said in shock, "This thing's built like a soda can." The remark spread among the men, half in humor, half in horror. They couldn't believe the Japanese were sending pilots into combat in something so exposed. The Betty's fuel tanks, huge and unprotected, were nestled directly in the wings, an invitation to disaster under enemy fire. A single tracer round, they realized, would ignite the whole plane in seconds. The Americans began to understand why the Betty was so infamous for bursting into flames during dogfights. As they stripped the bomber further, their astonishment only deepened. The G4M had virtually no armor plating, not for the crew, not for the engines, not even around the cockpit. Its main defensive feature was its speed and range. The engineers noted that even its control cables were unprotected, vulnerable to a single lucky bullet. Compared to the US B-25 Mitchell or B-17 Flying Fortress, the Betty seemed suicidal, but at the same time its brilliance was undeniable. Every ounce of unnecessary weight had been sacrificed for range. It could fly from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back without refueling, something no Allied bomber could match at the time. When the intelligence team compiled their report, they were torn between admiration and disbelief. One officer wrote, "The Japanese have traded safety for reach. They've built a bomber that can strike anywhere, but it cannot survive a fight." It was both an engineering marvel and a death trap. To the Americans, it revealed a mindset, one that valued the mission over the man. The Betty's pilots were expected to carry out their orders, even if it meant certain death, and the design reflected that grim truth. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the findings caused a stir. Military analysts pored over the blueprints and field notes, comparing them with combat reports from the Pacific. The Betty's design philosophy, extreme range at the cost of survivability, showed how desperate Japan had been to project power across the vast Pacific Ocean. Unlike the US, which could rely on island bases and carriers, Japan had to cover enormous distances from its home islands. The G4M's light frame and massive fuel capacity were the only way to make that possible. It was a gamble born of necessity, and one that had worked brilliantly early in the war. But as the Allies gained air superiority, that gamble became a fatal flaw. American pilots, now equipped with superior radar and long-range fighters, turned the skies into a death trap for unarmored bombers like the Betty. The captured plane became a teaching tool. US pilots studied it closely, learning exactly where to aim during dogfights, the wings, where the massive fuel tanks sat exposed, or the engines, which lacked even basic protection. The result was devastating. Japanese bomber losses skyrocketed. Still, there was something haunting about the wreckage. The men who studied it couldn't help but think about the crews who had flown inside these fragile machines, knowing that one spark could turn them into fireballs. To them, the G4M wasn't just a flawed design, it was a symbol of courage and desperation. The engineers who built it had created something extraordinary within impossible constraints. The pilots who flew it had done so with unflinching bravery. As the investigation concluded, one intelligence officer reportedly looked over the battered fuselage and said quietly, "They built it to reach far, but not to come home." It was a chilling summary of the Japanese approach to war, an unwavering commitment to striking the enemy, no matter the cost. The captured Betty, now a burned and battered trophy, told the story of an empire's rise and its hubris. It represented a moment in history when ambition outran reason, when range was mistaken for invincibility. And as American engineers dismantled its fragile frame piece by piece, they understood what the Japanese pilots had surely known all along, that the ocean, vast and merciless, would eventually swallow machines like this whole. When the Americans began running their full flight tests on the captured G4M bomber, they wanted to understand not just how it was built, but how it behaved in the air. Mechanics worked for days restoring its engines, patching bullet holes, and reassembling its control surfaces with the precision of surgeons. They knew that once it was airborne again, this fragile Japanese bomber would reveal the full story behind its design. And when the day finally came, the American test pilot assigned to the mission, Major William Bill Harding, climbed into the cockpit with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He had flown dozens of aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, but never anything like this. Inside the cockpit, the first impression was simplicity. There were no thick layers of armor, no reinforced glass like in American planes. The gauges were basic, the seats thin, and the metal bulkheads so light that Harding could almost dent them with his knuckles. The smell of oil and burnt metal still lingered from its crash landing. But when he started the engines, something remarkable happened. The twin Mitsubishi Kasi radial engines came to life with a smooth, thunderous growl. Harding later said it was like hearing a lion breathe. Despite its fragile body, the bomber's power plant was formidable, strong, steady, and surprisingly efficient. As the G4M taxied down the strip, a group of American mechanics watched with uneasy fascination. They'd reinforced the landing gear and patched the fuel system, but many still doubted the thing would hold together. Harding eased the throttle forward, and the bomber surged down the runway, light and quick, almost eager to fly. In seconds, it lifted off effortlessly, climbing into the blue sky. For a moment, even the skeptics were stunned. It moved like a ghost, graceful and silent compared to the thunderous roar of American bombers like the B-25 or B-17. Once airborne, Harding began his test maneuvers. He climbed to altitude, banked, and turned, noting the responsiveness of the controls. The aircraft was astonishingly light, so much so that it felt unstable at high speeds. Even minor gusts of wind caused the wings to flex. It was fast, yes, but fragile. Harding's notes later described it as flying a racehorse built from paper. Every time he banked too sharply or pulled into a steep climb, he could feel the airframe strain. There was no margin for error. As he pushed the aircraft higher, he noticed another thing, the range. The fuel efficiency was extraordinary. The engines ran cool and steady, and the fuel gauges barely budged. It dawned on him why the Japanese had sacrificed so much protection. They had built this bomber to reach far beyond what anyone thought possible. From Tokyo to Manila, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, the Betty could go where others couldn't. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, that meant everything. But Harding also understood the terrible cost. If this aircraft ever took a hit, it wouldn't survive long enough to glide home. Back on the ground, the test crew eagerly awaited his report. When Harding climbed out, his expression was conflicted, part admiration, part disbelief. "She flies beautifully," he admitted, "but one spark and she's gone." He described how the slightest burst of gunfire could turn the bomber into a fireball. There was no self-sealing in the tanks, no armor around the cockpit, and no escape route for the crew. The men who flew it were essentially flying torches. American intelligence officers soon realized the deeper implications. The Japanese weren't just building planes. They were building weapons of reach and sacrifice. The G4M wasn't meant to survive long battles. It was meant to strike deep and fast, to deliver its payload and trust fate. This philosophy would later evolve into something far darker, the kamikaze doctrine. The same design principles, speed, range, and the willingness to die in the cockpit, echoed eerily in Japan's later suicide missions. Harding's test flight reports were circulated across Allied command. They became critical reading for U.S. bomber crews and fighter pilots. Knowing the Betty's weaknesses, its vulnerable fuel tanks, its unarmored fuselage, its thin wings, gave Allied airmen a decisive edge in combat. From that moment on, American pilots knew exactly where to aim when they saw the sleek silhouette of a Japanese G4M glinting in the sun. But even as they learned how to destroy it, there was a quiet respect among those who studied it. Harding later reflected in his notes that the G4M was as much a symbol of courage as of flaw. The men who flew it weren't fools or fanatics. They were soldiers bound by duty, flying into battle in a machine that offered them almost no protection. The bomber's elegance and vulnerability made it both tragic and beautiful, a paradox that perfectly captured Japan's war philosophy. Perfection of purpose over preservation of life. The captured bomber's final flight ended on a solemn note. After completing its tests, the aircraft was grounded permanently, its engines removed for study. For weeks afterward, mechanics and pilots visited it like a relic, touching its thin skin, peering into its stripped cockpit, marveling at the decisions that had shaped it. It stood there silent and fragile, a testament to a different kind of courage. The Americans had learned what they came for. The mystery was solved. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't a mistake. They were a deliberate sacrifice, a design born from necessity and belief. And as Major Harding looked at the grounded bomber one last time, he said quietly to his crew, "They built it to go farther than we ever thought possible. But they paid for every mile with blood." By the time Allied intelligence teams had completed their evaluation of the captured G4M bomber, one thing was clear. The Japanese had built their air force around an entirely different concept of warfare. The Americans were used to flying machines that protected their crews at all costs, self-sealing fuel tanks, layers of armor, and escape hatches built to give men a fighting chance. But for the Japanese, survival was secondary to the mission. This cultural and strategic difference fascinated and unsettled the American analysts in equal measure. They weren't just studying an airplane anymore. They were studying a mindset. As engineers dismantled the G4M, they marveled at the craftsmanship. Every rivet and joint reflected precision. The aluminum alloy skin was light, expertly curved for aerodynamics. The control systems were minimalist but efficient. Japanese engineers had trimmed away every ounce of unnecessary weight to achieve maximum range. This wasn't an oversight or ignorance of modern safety. It was a deliberate design philosophy. They wanted endurance and reach above all else. The plane's designers, led by Kiro Honjo of Mitsubishi, were under strict orders. The bomber had to fly from the home islands to distant enemy bases and back over thousands of miles of open ocean, with no room for failure. Every kilogram of armor meant 1 kilogram less fuel, and so the armor was sacrificed. Reports from Japanese survivors confirmed that the crews of these bombers knew exactly what they were flying into. The G4M, nicknamed Betty by Allied forces, was referred to among Japanese airmen as hamaki, the cigar, because of its long, slender shape and, tragically, because it burned so easily when hit. Crews often joked grimly that once they took off, they were already dead men. It wasn't a figure of speech. It was a reflection of the harsh reality of their missions. Intelligence debriefs from captured Japanese officers painted a haunting picture. Pilots and gunners were not unaware of the aircraft's flaws. They were fully conscious of them. But they accepted those risks as part of their duty to the Emperor and the homeland. In their minds, self-preservation was a distant concern compared to service. This unyielding mindset was alien to most American pilots, who were trained to value teamwork, survival, and return for the next mission. To the Japanese, dying in the line of duty was not a failure. It was fulfillment. The American engineers compared notes with combat pilots who had faced the Betty in the skies over the Pacific. Time and again they described the same chilling sight, a G4M engulfed in flames after just a few hits. One pilot, Lieutenant Richard Tinsley, recalled dogfighting over the Solomon Islands and watching a Betty try to evade his P-38 Lightning. "It was faster than I expected," he said later. "But once I hit the wing tank, the whole thing went up like a torch. No parachutes. Just fire." For him, that memory lingered for years, not just the destruction, but the knowledge that the men inside knew their chances and still went. These test results and testimonies reshaped Allied air strategy in the Pacific. American fighter pilots were briefed specifically on the G4M's vulnerabilities. They learned to target the wings first, where the unprotected fuel tanks sat, rather than the fuselage. Anti-aircraft units too began adjusting their aim patterns to exploit this fatal flaw. It wasn't long before the once-feared bomber became known among U.S. forces as the Flying Lighter. Its reputation for burning instantly spread across Allied bases. And yet, even with these weaknesses exposed, the G4M continued to appear over battlefields for years. For the Japanese, the Betty's range still made it indispensable. It was the only aircraft capable of reaching deep Allied positions or executing surprise strikes from distant bases. This same capability had enabled Japan's devastating early attacks in the war, including the sinking of the British warships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in 1941, an event that shocked the world. The Betty had been instrumental in those operations, and that success only reinforced Japan's faith in its design philosophy. In a sense, the G4M embodied Japan's wartime identity, elegant in form, lethal in purpose, and tragically flawed by overconfidence. As the tide of the war turned against Japan, this flaw became fatal. American fighters dominated the skies, and Betty bombers, once symbols of Japan's reach, became symbols of its losses. By late 1944, many G4Ms were used in desperate kamikaze missions, their long range repurposed for one-way flights. The same lightness that once gave them speed now made them perfect for suicide runs. Back in the United States, after the full analysis was published, one phrase appeared repeatedly in intelligence reports: a masterpiece of engineering trapped in a philosophy of death. That line captured everything the American analysts felt. They couldn't help but respect the brilliance behind the machine, the flawless engines, the aerodynamic purity, but they also saw the tragedy behind it. Every bolt, every weld was part of a design that prioritized honor over life. For Major Harding, who had flown the captured G4M, the experience stayed with him long after the war. In interviews years later, he described it as the saddest airplane I ever flew. Not because it was poorly made, but because it was too good at what it wasn't meant to do: survive. The Betty's lightness, its grace, its reach, all those things came at the ultimate cost. In the end, the G4M bomber wasn't just a captured artifact, it was a message. A warning about the dangers of absolute devotion to a cause, even when it meant building beauty that was destined to burn. And for the Americans who studied it, it became a symbol of both respect and resolve. Respect for the courage of those who flew it, and resolve never to build war machines that asked men to die for efficiency's sake. When the war finally ended, and Japan lay in ruins, the last surviving G4M Betty bombers sat in rusting rows on airfields that had once symbolized Japan's pride and industrial prowess. Their once sleek fuselages, pitted by shrapnel and weathered by time, stood as silent witnesses to a philosophy that had carried a nation into the sky, and then brought it crashing back down. For the American engineers and pilots who had studied, flown and fought against these bombers, the story of the G4M became something more than a technical lesson. It was a meditation on the price of devotion, the meaning of courage, and the thin line between brilliance and tragedy in wartime innovation. After the capture and testing of the G4M, Allied intelligence distributed detailed reports throughout the US Navy and Army Air Forces. These documents were not merely about aircraft performance, they carried moral weight. They described the bomber as a paradox of ingenuity and vulnerability, a machine that reflected Japan's unique fusion of sacrifice and skill. Pilots and strategists studied these reports not only to understand their enemy's mistakes, but to prevent repeating them. For American designers, the lessons of the G4M were invaluable. They reinforced the idea that protection, both mechanical and human, was not a burden to performance, but the foundation of sustained success. Yet for all its shortcomings, the G4M left a mark of respect among those who faced it. Allied pilots, while they derided its flammability, could not ignore its impressive speed and range. Many admitted privately that they admired the courage of the crews who flew them. One veteran of the Pacific War, Lieutenant Charles Donovan, later said, "Those men were flying gasoline tanks, and they came at us anyway. You had to respect that. You couldn't not." This respect born from battle outlasted the hatred of war. In post-war Japan, the G4M's legacy took on a different meaning. For years, it became a symbol of both pride and pain. To some, it represented the height of Japanese aviation engineering, a time when the nation could produce a bomber that could reach across oceans with unmatched precision. To others, it was a stark reminder of the flawed ideology that demanded perfection and sacrifice at any cost. Japanese veterans who had served on G4Ms began speaking publicly in the 1950s and 60s, recounting the terror of long flights with unarmored fuel tanks, the way the planes would ignite from a single tracer round, and the feeling of duty that kept them going despite it all. Their stories transformed the Betty from a weapon into a memorial. A few surviving examples of the G4M were preserved in museums, both in Japan and the United States. Visitors who walked around these relics often found themselves struck by their elegance. The thin aluminum skin, the stretched wings, the meticulously riveted seams, it looked almost fragile. Standing next to one, you could imagine the sound of its engines, the vibration through the floor, the heat of the Pacific sun. But knowing what it represented made that beauty bittersweet. It was not just an airplane, it was a philosophy captured in metal, a belief in endurance, speed and self-sacrifice all fused into one. For American engineers, one of the greatest ironies was that the same qualities that doomed the G4M were what made it such an engineering marvel. Stripped of its moral and strategic context, the bomber was a masterpiece of aerodynamic design. The decision to remove armor, though tragic in effect, allowed for record-breaking range. In that range lay the technological DNA that would influence future generations of aircraft. Long-range reconnaissance planes, early jet bombers, and even civilian airliners that valued reach and fuel efficiency. The Betty's legacy, in a strange way, lived on through machines designed for peace. When Allied pilots recalled their encounters years later, there was always one moment that stayed vivid, the way a Betty would burn. Not in cruelty or triumph, but in solemn remembrance. One Marine Corps veteran described seeing a downed G4M descending into the sea, its engines still running. "It was like watching something beautiful die," he said softly. "You couldn't cheer for that. You just watched it go." That quote made its way into a post-war documentary, becoming a quiet summation of the war's emotional complexity. For the men who flew against them, and for those who studied them after, the G4M was more than an enemy. It was a lesson in how belief could shape technology, and how that technology could in turn shape fate. The unprotected fuel tanks, which once baffled US pilots, became a symbol of the human paradox of war, the will to create perfection, even when it leads to destruction. The G4M didn't just tell a story about design, it told a story about people, about devotion pushed to its breaking point. Today, when historians and aviation enthusiasts study the G4M, they see not just a relic of Japan's wartime engineering, but a warning written in aluminum. It reminds the world that progress without balance, and brilliance without compassion, can lead even the most advanced creation into tragedy. The G4M's fire burned bright across the skies of the Pacific, and though its flames have long faded, its lessons still flicker in the minds of those who study the cost of war. In the end, that captured bomber did leave the Americans speechless, not because its fuel tanks were unprotected, but because behind that flaw was a story of men who flew into the impossible, believing in something greater than themselves. It was a machine built with genius, flown with courage and remembered with awe. A weapon, yes, but also a mirror reflecting what it means to be human in the face of war's relentless demands.